Hi, I'm Seth Carus. I'm an emeritus professor at National Defense University. It was a unique event in history. In the history of chemical warfare, there had never been a day when more people were killed and died than happened at Halabja. There were, in fact, as many people died that day in Halabja as had died in the whole of the Iran-Iraq war of Iraqi use against the Iranians. Well, it actually affected my entire life in that I devoted most of the subsequent 30 years to the study of chemical and biological weapons. And in retrospect, I think I felt a tremendous sense of guilt because I'd known the Iraqis were using chemical weapons. I was following the Iran-Iraq war professionally in the 1980s. But I never really did anything to try to ensure that the use came to an end. And so, like many of my colleagues in Washington, I was stunned when what had been a battlefield weapon was suddenly turned on civilians in such a catastrophic way. The real targets of chemical weapons since the Second World War have almost always been civilians, not soldiers. And it's for obvious reasons. I mean, civilians are much more vulnerable than military. I mean, soldiers, even poorly trained ones, have, chemical defense equipment, they've got training, they've got tactics for dealing with chemical weapons, whereas civilians are totally vulnerable. It's the reason why chemicals are considered a weapon of mass destruction. It's not because of what it does to soldiers, it's rather the vulnerability of civilians. And so every time I heard somebody say chemicals are not a weapon of mass destruction, I'd point to Halabja where, in such a short period of time, thousands of people died. Well, it's one of these things that you can't predict, but we know from the past that there have been terrorist groups that have been interested in chemical and biological weapons, and occasionally a group will get its act together and use them in ways that are quite frightening. The classic example was the Japanese terrorist group Shinrikyo, which used sarin, one of the same chemicals used in Halabja, in the Tokyo subways back in 1995. So it's impossible to predict when another such attack can occur, but we know that there is a prospect of it happening, and unlike military use, this is going to occur in a setting where civilians are the primary target. Well, that's actually unknowable because we don't really know what agent they would use and how they would use it. The only thing we can hope is that they would be deterred from using it because of concern about what the retaliation would be. If we were able to determine that a country like North Korea used a biological agent here, I think the response from the United States would be quite severe. Attribution is at the core of it, because unless you can tell who's responsible, you can't really take effective response measures. Fortunately, we're a lot better at that than we were even a few years ago. In both the chemical and biological area, major investments have been made, and there are a lot of capabilities for attribution that did not exist even a few years ago.